and it's very much geared towards goods and materials. And services has always been this thing that's kind of like too difficult or it's secondary. But in the meantime, it's been growing. So I do feel like, of course, those other areas of procurement are super important, but I feel like they're pretty well catered for. It's like it's like if you look at the contingent workforce market. I mean, obviously, the big VMS providers and the MSP solutions started in kind of like very earliest late 90s, kind of like beginning of the 2000s. That's a pretty well buttoned down solution these days.
Yeah, I
Whereas if you
agree.
compare the services side of it, it's still at that early age of maturity, I would argue.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Yeah. No, it's interesting you bring it up because when we talk about, the value service program, we talk about that whole rubric of, you don't think about direct, indirect, talk about like people-based, versus, goods or, how to kind of differentiate that. But I think you're right. I think, the more that we can get organizations start thinking about it in those terms, I think it actually would probably hit more on the way that their businesses are looking to engage with these type of services. I think there's probably some legacy, into your earlier point where some of the original kind of mind, or I guess architecture was direct, indirect, maybe like CapEx, OpEx, and it needs to fit in a bucket from an accounting perspective. But I think that's something that's already accounted for, to your point, where maybe it needs to think about, don't let these kind of existing technologies hinder your way of thinking about how a really great service procurement solution can meet your needs. So I bring it up because, I think there's been certainly many instances where we've talked to customers about a service procurement solution with a technology. And a lot of times, like, hey, for our indirect category, we already use the enterprise ERP, right, to manage all of this. And okay, I understand that. But when you say you're managing, what are you actually doing on the services space? And it's like, oh, we can get a spend report, if that, right? If that with, and then you start poking into the any level of granularity, and certainly nothing about the people aspect of it at all. But I think, a lot of times maybe those original, maybe legacy leaders in those space, like, oh, we've already addressed it. And we also don't want to, in their head, introduce in their view like another technology to complicate the solution, which I think is our job to poke more holes into that. Because I think at this point, yes, there'd be an introduction of another technology, but you and I both know there's a lot of great, obviously, integrations that could go into place that you can still feed that data into a more enterprise ERP, so you have all that spent all together. I just truly don't believe that argument of like not wanting to complicate things is enough of value to not dive more into services with all of the benefits you can get into that with a huge amount of spend that's untouched. Because to your point, yes, the enterprise ERP has really great hold of like goods and services, but you have all the levers, all the cost savings mechanisms, very well oiled. There's not much more you can do in that space. But now there's other category they're managing your ERP that you admittedly say that you don't have a lot of visibility into. So let's kind of get the other enabling technologies and get more out of it so we can get even more cost savings. So we now squeeze everything you can. And I've made that same argument now in the, MSP space. We have so many, customers I think have done all they can on the staff aug side as far as like reducing rates and trying to do rate cuts. Really, the bang for the buck will be in services for them. And the amount of spend and the way that contracting is done, it is not going to be as much of a disruptive change as I think a lot of potential sponsors think it can be, because there's honestly so much margin a lot of times
Oh
in
my
these
God.
services contracts
Yeah, yeah.
where, yeah, the service suppliers will still make good money, right? And I as a provider, always strike the balance. The service providers they're all great partners. They're not bad providers. I think also a lot of times they just do what the business thinks they need to do. But it just calls up like that there is, an opportunity for people that understand, these kind of different mechanisms to get really great cost savings, get better control, and really hone in the service supplier community into those true strategic partners that are providing demonstrable value to the organization, right? And not just these veiled staff augmentation agreements or these suppliers that they're perfectly fine with not having any accountability and charging a huge, huge markup on things, right? That was our job, right? As the kind of the experts and things to get really great engaged suppliers that they will benefit from it as well too, but really also like get a really well-run, cost-effective, meeting the business needs service and procurement solution for the end customers.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, other organizations are getting on top of this. What I would urge anyone who's even considering this to think about is can you compete effectively in your market if you don't do this? Because you need to get work done. And this is where I think it's really interesting the way that services procurement straddles and workforce parts of the business, strategic workforce planning, kind of potentially HR talent acquisition type functions or contingent workforce type functions, and pure procurement functions. But from a CEO's point of view, they've got options as to how they get work done. I can use my permanent workforce, I can use contractors and temps, I can use AI, I can outsource it to my services supply chain. But if you've got a big chunk of that that isn't buttoned down, and in large organizations, typically what, 6 to 10 times the amount of spend as contingent workforce. In smaller organizations, maybe 4 to 6 times, something like it's a massive liability. It's a massive commitment. If you haven't got that buttoned down, I personally think that, as a CEO, I would be, that would give me sleepless nights thinking, okay, have we got the capacity? How good is that capacity? What are we wasting the money? Do we even know what's happening? Do we even know who these suppliers are? What if something happens in the market that means I suddenly need them to do something else for me, or I suddenly need them to do more for me? Is that going to work? Are they going to do a good job? Are we going to be able to get it done in time? It's like that would keep me awake at night. I would want to have this stuff nailed because as an organization, they're spending a lot of money on it and it is a significant factor in driving their success. So I just think that's where I think it's become more of understood around those facets of the market, which is why, and it's kind of coalesced into this thing that is services procurement, and people can't quite get away with now just going, oh, well, we've got that PO level information, and I've seen it on calls myself where one stakeholder might be kind of edging towards that argument, and another stakeholder at the same company might say, hey, that's not good enough. And I find that really interesting when companies are starting to like, have a bit of an internal dialogue where they're saying, where there are people like kind of saying we really should do something about this. And that's something that I've definitely seen accelerating. And you probably would have seen that. I certainly saw that less when we was kind of starting out, say, kind of like 5, 6 years ago. But I'm sure for you, if you look back right to those early programs, it probably wasn't anything like that kind of discussion.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think to your point, a lot of it's like, hey, yeah, even 5 years ago, a lot of individual, stakeholders, like the baseline visibility is good enough, but I think it's also a lot of, at that time they still had other levers they could pull, right? Maybe there was still at that point more levers they could pull for cost savings and staff log or like other categories. But it's like I said
Yeah.
before, like now that stone cannot be squeezed anymore, and they need to be creative and have more tools at their disposal, right, to enact, different types of cost savings or just like management, more sophisticated management of spend. And this is the area that. I don't want to call it the wild, wild west, but there's just a lot of untapped opportunity, right? If you just get the right technologies and services in place that can really kind of unearth those opportunities and then have that execution strategy on top of it.